Hi, my name is Pastor Obed, and welcome to this week's Think on These Things. Think on These Things is a platform that invites you to engage in Scripture and to open the Bible in ways that may bring about growth in your own life. And as you grow, that through your growth, others also may find growth as well. And so I desire that this becomes a weekly appointment that you and I can keep together as we seek to understand the Bible through this very instrumental tool that is put together for us to be able to delve into Scripture together. This week's topic is on extreme heat. Now remember, the topic for the next 3 months is going to be on in the crucible with Christ, talking about suffering. Talking about the tough times that we go through in this world. And as Christians, what does that do to our faith, to our view of God, and how do we relate to other people that go through suffering as well? So very, very important. So extreme heat. Have you ever gone through a tough time that you could consider that was a very extreme heat moment in your life? And indeed, that's really what this week is inviting you and I to study. It's basically taking us through the journey of some of the heroes of the Bible, from Abraham to Paul to even Jesus himself, and giving us some insights into their own struggles whenever they went through a tough time. Talking about Abraham, who had to sacrifice his son. Well, did he? But God invited him into that journey, but he made that decision in his heart, really, and took his son to the Mount Moriah, but God had an intervention, obviously. And then down to the story of Paul, where Paul talks about his shipwreck and being whipped and being stoned and being persecuted for his faith. And lastly, to the story of Jesus, who is really the author and the finish of our faith, who is also the embodiment of true suffering. Talk about suffering. In fact, the main text for this week is found in a chapter in the Bible, Isaiah 53, that focuses and talks about the suffering of Jesus. In fact, I want to suggest to you that Isaiah 53 should be part of your at least weekly diet as you study the Bible. If not daily, because that is a reminder not only of just how much Jesus went through for our own salvation, but it puts into perspective whenever we go through suffering as well. How do we handle that in the light of how Jesus handled his own suffering? And so the topic is extreme heat. The main text, let me read it for you. Isaiah 53, verse 10, it says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." It can be a troubling text. It can be a troubling thing whenever we think about associating suffering and God. In fact, for most people in the world, suffering is always a good indication that God is absent. In fact, I'm sure you've heard people say this, or you've said this yourself. Where was God when I was going through this? This week's study is basically inviting us to try and grapple with this whole idea of extreme circumstances of suffering and how we can handle that. Now, I've got some important questions that I think will be important for you guys to at least grapple with in your lesson study together, in your group, in your family, or even for yourself if you don't have anyone to study with this week's lesson. And here's the 3 questions I've got for you this week. Are you ready for them? Question number 1. How do we learn to trust God's heart as a heart of love for us, especially during extreme heat moments in our lives? Because those are moments where people question God's love. How do we remain and keep that perspective clear in our minds and hearts, that God is still a God of love, especially in those times of trouble. Question number 2. Why does God take the real risk to his reputation? And it's a gamble really to his reputation, to allow suffering to come into people's lives and even to Christians' lives. I mean, if I were God, I'd probably not let trouble come so that I can have a good reputation. But God takes a risk to his own reputation by allowing people and us to go through a tough time. But there must be a reason for it. And last question is, what are some of the practical biblical promises or tips that you can find in Scripture that have brought you personally through in moments of extreme heat in your life, that taught you to still depend on God, to still trust in God, and just like Job say, though he may slay me, yet I will trust in him. One of the most powerful part of this whole thing for me is a story in the introduction that says, hey, the story of C.S. Lewis, who's a very well-known author, a British author from the 1950s and 60s, and actually even 40s a little bit, during the Second World War. During the time his wife was dying, the little pamphlet there has a story that he says there that during that time of his wife's death, the danger and the risk for him was not so much doubting God's very existence. It was rather doubting and questioning the reputation of God. Who is God when we go through tough times? So may I invite you to enjoy this week's study and prepare for this week's study. Get ready to get to church on time, to Sabbath school on time this week, and open the Bible and invite others to join you as you engage in Scripture. And remember, always think on these things. God bless you.